Tonight we continue our series of interviews with candidates for Suffolk County District Attorney. Our guest has worked in the county as an assistant DA for 10 years, but he also has experience in Boston as a teacher and mentor. We'd like to welcome Greg Henning. Thank you very much for being with us, Greg.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Talk about that experience, because you were an assistant DA, then you went into teaching, and you came back. Talk about that trajectory.
Sure. Well, in 2009, I started while I was a prosecutor already in the Suffolk County DA's office. I started volunteering in a program called College Bound Dorchester. I was a coach and a teacher, kind of a tutor for some of the students on the basketball team. And it turned out that one of the young men that I had previously prosecuted as the leader of the gun prosecution task force was a player on the team. So over the course of the year that I was tutoring and coaching that team, I got to know him, and I got to understand a little bit better the decisions he'd made and the pressures that he was facing that led him to make certain choices in his life. And after having that experience with him and thinking about the work that I was doing as a prosecutor, I decided to make a change in my career, and I left the DA's office and I went into teaching. So I became a middle and high school teacher.
Well, working with College Bound Dorchester, you're working with people who are, in a way, trying to turn their lives around.
Absolutely.
This is something we want the criminal justice system to do, too.
Yeah.
What's the connection between them that you're going to bring to this job as a DA if you win?
Yeah, the connection between them is that there are people that we deal with in the criminal justice system that either didn't have an opportunity to avoid making a bad decision or did not have the support system in place at home or at school to help guide them to avoid making bad decisions. So when I left to become a teacher, one of the things I wanted to do was work with students in order to help them avoid making those bad choices that could lead to being involved in the criminal justice system. When I was doing the teaching, I realized that I could have as much, if not more, of an impact mentoring some of my students after I left teaching while also being a prosecutor. So I started taking on that role with some of my defendants. With the permission of the court and their attorneys, I would work with them both while they were in custody and also when they get out to try to divert them from making those bad decisions and to avoid being involved in the criminal justice system again.
When you were a prosecutor, what kind of cases did you work on most of the time?
In the beginning, I did general prosecution as a younger ADA, and I worked in the Boston Municipal Court Central Division, and then I became the supervisor of the Gun Prosecution Task Force, which dealt with firearm possession cases. After about 2.5 years, I moved into the Major Felony Bureau, doing general prosecution in Superior Court, grand jury investigations, stabbings, armed robberies, things of that nature. And then I moved on to the senior trial unit when I came back to the DA's office in 2013. The last job I had, the job I have now since I took my leave of absence, is the supervisor of the gang unit in the DA's office. And over the course of my career, I've done shootings, drug cases, indecent assault and batteries. I've done grand jury work, homicide cases, pretty much you name it.
What do you see yourself doing about the gun cases that really don't make the news? The gun possession case that could be a murder prevented. And on the other hand, you don't want that murder to take place, but you also don't want to see somebody go even farther down the wrong path if you put them in jail.
Absolutely. Great question. The work that I did when I was running the gang unit was in part to focus on just the type of cases that you're speaking about. And one of the things we started doing was tracking data on firearm possession and firearm discharge cases in the city of Boston, leaving aside the northern part of the county. And what we found was that over the course of 2017, there were over 700 incidents of a gun being discharged in the city. So not just where a person gets hit with a bullet, but also something where a gun goes off and a person is either targeted or they discharge a weapon and nobody is around to report it. And the reason that that's such an important thing for the community is that every time a gun goes off, if you think about the neighborhood and the people that are there, that's some mother that has to tell her son or daughter what that sound is. That's a family that has to instruct their kids, when you hear that sound, you need to duck. And that is the type of huge impact that firearm cases can have in our community, and it's the work that I focused on as the supervisor in the gang unit. And it's something I would put more resources into if I became the district attorney, because those type of firearm and weapon cases have a tremendous impact on the community, even if a person is not struck with a weapon. The experience I have as a prosecutor for 10 years, and in particular supervising the gang unit, makes me the best candidate to do that sort of work, because I understand where the work needs to focus and the impact that that work can have on the community.
This has been a news, and we're talking with the candidate for Suffolk County DA, Greg Henning. Greg, what about the role of the DA as a potential criminal justice advocate for some kinds of reforms? Let's say, for example, changing the age of juvenile jurisdiction. Do you think something ought to be changed like that?
Sure. There's a lot of things that the criminal justice system needs to work on. And the best person to go into a role of district attorney is somebody that knows how the system works and what doesn't, and somebody that has experience actually prosecuting cases. Because we can talk theoretically and philosophically about reform, but unless you can go into the office on day one and point your finger and say, this needs to change and this is how we need to change it, we're all really just talking about it philosophically. So there are things that need to change. The criminal justice reform bill that's being debated right now has some very positive pieces in it. It still needs to be examined and people are hashing out the details in the legislature, but there's certainly changes that can be made. And somebody who's worked inside the system, both as a prosecutor and also as a teacher and a coach and a mentor, and somebody who's visited the young men and women that actually are impacted by incarceration. I've visited House of Corrections, state prison, different facilities where I've worked with the young men and women that I've prosecuted. I understand what needs to change because I see how the system can impact lives.
We've had this poll recently. It might not exactly be news, but among people of color in Boston, a lot of distrust of police, but maybe even more of the court system. I know you've described some of that already, maybe,
yeah.
But what would you do to address that?
Well, the poll that you're talking about came out about a week and a half ago and it got covered in the Boston Globe. The thing that really struck me about that poll that was perhaps the most disturbing part is that it said that only 16% of people of color, and I think it was in particular African American people, said that they felt safe living in their neighborhood. And one of the reasons that's such a demoralizing statistic is because it reflects how much the things that I was mentioning, the unsolved shootings, the firearm cases, can impact a community even if we don't see a person get hit with a bullet. So I think part of the way that we can rebuild some of the lost trust is to help make those cases and help cut down on the type of collateral consequences that we see from violence and firearm cases that happen in the community, because the only way to rebuild trust is to be able to get people committed to fixing their community along with law enforcement, because the law enforcement community, both prosecutors and police, do want to work to try to reduce crime, and we need everyone's help in order to do it.
Another reason for distrust, of course, is that some people, especially some witnesses, are afraid of retaliation, not from authorities, but from somewhere in the city, the neighborhood.
Absolutely.
Is there something that can be done to ameliorate that?
In the time that I've worked at the DA's office, I think the biggest thing that we've noticed about civilians, and in particular witnesses of violent crime, not wanting to cooperate or needing assistance in moving, is that there isn't really a place to put somebody that wants to move from the community. So if you're a person that's been impacted by violence, that's had a shooting or some act of violence in your neighborhood, there isn't a lot of housing. There are not a lot of facilities where we can move somebody to in an emergency or even for a short or medium term basis. If you walk around the city, you see sky rises or buildings going up all over the place. I think that one of the things we can focus on is using the resources for victim and witness relocation to try to identify housing that can be specifically allocated for people that are witnesses and victims of violent crime, so that we're not dealing with a waiting list in order to move somebody in an emergency situation. And the other thing is that the victims and witnesses who can benefit from the resources in the Witness Protection Fund, they need to know that we're working hard to do that for them, and that means being able to make housing more available for them.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Candidate for Suffolk County District Attorney, Greg Henning.